We're now going to look at how to apply the radical candor framework. But before we do that, let's listen to Kim Scott as to why radical candor is important.
So I want to spend most of our time today talking about how to actually give great feedback in this framework you've developed. But to start, I'd love to hear the backstory. How did you become passionate about this subject?
It happened in the worst moment of my career. I had hired this guy, we'll call him Bob, and I really liked Bob. Bob was charming and he was funny. He would do stuff like, I remember we were at one of those management offsites that are endless where you're playing some stupid get to know you game that everybody hates but nobody dares to put up their hand and say this is ridiculous. And finally Bob said, I have an idea that'll be much faster. Why don't we just go around the table and everybody confess what candy their parents used when potty training them. Weird, but fast. So we did it. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment, right? So I don't know. I found this funny and charming. I liked Bob. One problem with Bob, he was doing terrible work. His work just absolutely sucked. And I couldn't understand what was going on because he had this amazing resume. He had done all this great stuff. I learned later the problem was that he was smoking pot in the bathroom every day, which maybe explained all that candy. But anyway, I didn't know any of this in the moment. And so I kept telling Bob, I gave him the kind of head fake praise. I was like, Bob, you're so great, you're so smart. This is a great start. Maybe just work a little harder on it. It could be a little better. And this went on for 10 months, and then the inevitable thing happened, and I realized that I was going to lose half my team if I didn't fire Bob. Everybody was so fed up with his subpar work. And so I sat down and had the conversation that I should have had with Bob months ago. And when I explained to him where things stood, he sort of pushed the chair back from the table. And he looked right at me and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question is going around in my head with no very good answer, he says, "Why didn't anybody tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And I realized in that moment that I have failed Bob in 6 different ways. I failed to solicit feedback from him. I never asked him how things were going from his perspective. Maybe I was doing something that was driving him so crazy, it was forcing him to toke up in the bathroom every day. I don't know. I didn't find out, right? So I failed to get praise. I failed to get criticism, more importantly, from him. And I also failed to give him praise that was meaningful. The kind of praise I gave him was just a head fake. And I failed to tell him when his work wasn't really good enough. So 2 more failures. And I also, probably worst of all, I had failed to create the environment on the team where everyone would tell Bob what was really good and when he was going off the rails. And because I had made these mistakes, Bob is getting fired. I'm having to fire Bob. And it was too late to fix it for Bob. All I could do in that moment was to make a really solemn promise to myself that I would never make that mistake again.
Let's take a look at an example in real life for the 4 quadrants. So here's a quick real life example of the 4 quadrants. Imagine that you're hanging out with a new friend in public and they see someone that they find, attractive and want to talk to. Now, before they're about to head over to make this connection, you notice that their fly is down. What do? Well, if we're applying the 4 quadrants, if you are silent and worried about his feelings, which is ruinous empathy, you will be silent. If you're being manipulative in sincerity, you'd be silent, but you would be worried about your own feelings. If you were exhibiting obnoxious aggression, you would shout, "Look, his fly is down." But if you were actually using radical candor, where you cared personally and challenged directly, you would quietly whisper in his ear, "Hey, your fly is down." And so, in order to be radically candid, you must have 3 components that Kim Scott realized she made mistakes on, and how you were able to make sure that your friend would be able to pick up this person without being embarrassed. So let's look at these 3 components. 1, you got to start by asking for criticism, not by giving it. 2, you have to balance praise and criticism. And then 3, you have to understand the perilous border between obnoxious aggression and radical candor. I want to describe number 3 a little bit more. This is the difference between your work sucks versus your work is not meeting the bar we agreed to. In the next section, you are going to be able to look at an example and non-example of using radical candor for a given scenario.